Hi, this is Doug Vogt from the Diehole Foundation. This is part 2 of video series 7 on God's code system. You should see part 1 first, which covered this date of October 16, 2046, and going back in time every 12,068 days. The 12,068 days represents the exact number of years between geomagnetic reversals, aka polar reversals. This one's going to cover not just that table that you saw in part 1, but the number of days or years between two events were also equally important and somewhat quite shocking. And then finally, when you see all of this, and you consider also the part 1 of this, the question of free will has to come to mind, and we will talk about that later, and you'll have to make your own decisions too after what you see here. Again, I'll be going through chapters 11 in both books and some stuff I had found since then. The first video, I didn't give a warning, and I probably should give one now. If you're what they call a snowflake or somebody under 21, and you're in a college and you are so upset by just listening to conservative speech or anything other than left-wing socialist or liberal or communist speech taught to you by your professors, then you probably shouldn't see this. You're not adult and mature enough to assimilate what you're about to see and extrapolate what it really means. It's just going to upset you, so don't watch this. You can watch my other videos and get a good education, but this is going to upset you a lot. We'll start in with again, the previous video established this date of October 16, 2046. You look at it as a drop-dead date. That is the date, within that date range between September and December 2046 is when the Gleisberg cycle is going to happen. 136 Gleisberg cycles, again, is 12,068 years. The rest of the video, you're going to see these numbers show up. A quarter of the number is 3,017, half the number 6,034, which is the number of chapters and verses in the Torah. 12,068, the root number, 2 times the number, and then 3 times the number. And all this has to do with the clock cycle of polar reversal. Now, what's the cataclysm? I found this picture on the internet. It's kind of interesting. Two things happen, and it will be completely explained in video series 4 on the Ice Age and polar reversal, which I'm going to do immediately after I get done with this one. And I don't know how many parts are going to be, but it will cover absolutely everything. That the sun novas, all the proof for it, and what happens on the Earth, what causes the Ice Age, what happens to the other planets, and where all the water that was on Mars at one time, where it went, and where the oxygen went also, and everything like that. One of the parts that happens is during the reversal, the Earth's rotation stops for about 8 hours. Well, you can guess what happens. Just a simple test. Take a baking pan and fill it with water, and increase your speed to about 3 or 4 miles an hour, and then stop short. And then you can guess what's going to happen to the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans. Got the picture? That's the origin of the Great Flood. In this case, this is obviously an old picture of New York City. There's the Twin Towers. The wave isn't going to come from the south. It's going to be coming from the west, because you can guess what happens to the Pacific Ocean when the Earth stops. It's going to be coming in an easterly direction real fast. But all this will be explained beyond reasonable proof that this happens. Okay, our first one is the Passover night. This has to do with how we wound up showing up at the mountain during the first expedition in November of 1997. And I'll give you a little history of the Passover. The Passover was in the fall, not in the springtime, and I proved that when I go through volume 3 on the Passover. You'll see what happened. Anyway, I estimate the Passover was September 11, 2006. Sorry, 1306, 2006, that's a joke. 1306 BCE. When Moses and Aaron was in front of the Pharaoh, who was Amenhotep IV, they were there during the summer solstice in Tanis when the Pharaoh blessed the waters of the Nile. And that was the summer solstice. In that case, it was June 21st, 1306 BCE. That was the summer solstice. Now, the reason I have a picture of Moses and the sheep, because that's where he was at the time or doing, you have to know a little bit about horticulture. All sheep in the northern hemisphere are born in March and some part in April, early part of April. That's what they all are. So, the Bible says to Moses, just before the Passover night, which was the full moon, that you take a lamb of the first year and do not take one from the mother's milk. In other words, it had to be weaned already. Well, it takes 45 days for that newborn lamb to get to 15 pounds and weaned. So, if the Passover happened in March or beginning of April, you wouldn't have any lambs of the first year to sacrifice. Now, when this happens in September, that problem disappears. They're still of the first year and they've been weaned. Keep that in mind. Now, that verse about don't take a lamb from its mother's milk shows up once in context of the sentence. The other two times out of context of the sentence. They just show up and there it is. They're not talking about whether it be don't mix meat with milk. No. It happens to tell you this time of the season that the Passover happened. Okay, so we were at the mountain November 29th, 1997. That was exactly 50 years to the hour of when the UN voted to create the State of Israel. So Moses had to be at the hill, Mount Sinai. That was the family homestead, by the way. He had to be there in March 25th, because the lambs were born during March and a little bit April. He's there. He's stuck there for a while. And I don't know if this is the date or a few days after that he went into the cave and really deep into the cave and tripped something and this thing played out for him, the burning bush and stuff like that, which had to have been a hologram. Bushes burn and get consumed unless it's a hologram. Anyway, much to my surprise and shock when I figured it out, the number of days between March 25th, 1306, and when we arrived at the hill, and a few days later, I think the date turned out exactly when I discovered where the Ark of the Covenant was placed, that platform. It was exactly 1,206,800 days. It's the 12,068 number with a couple of zeros after it. Programmed. There's no question about it. I didn't plan it. I didn't know about this until later. Okay, from this on, these are the sequences that I have found. What you're going to learn from me here, you'll be able to find as many also. Some will be somewhat shocking. Now, when Joshua died, they estimate it was 1200 BCE, the beginning of the Judges period. And from there to the fall of Jerusalem, the Judean kingdom happened 587 BCE. That was 613 years. The Orthodox tradition is that 613 commandments in the Torah. I didn't count them. There's another part of this story that's interesting about that number. And I'll tell you. In 1996, we went to Israel. By coincidence, it was also the 3,000th year anniversary that David chose Jerusalem as his capital. Anyway, we traveled all over Israel, and I was interested in the story of Jacob when he leaves Beersheba, where his mother sends him off to go to Laban, her relative, he goes one-day journey out of Beersheba, and he lands at a place where he has a dream and puts his head on a rock, and he sees angels, a ladder ascending and descending from heaven, and angels going up and down. And he said, never thought this place was so holy. Anyway, I think we found the place. It's an archaeological site now north of Luz, and is formerly some kind of city there. Chances are it's probably what the city of Luz was. Anyway, the elevation of the place on the map, on the Israeli map, is 613 meters. So that kind of twerked my interest. Okay, 613 meters, what does it really mean? And I knew the coincidence here about the laws. So I studied about the meter. How did the French come up with the meter? Well, what they did is they took a longitude from the North Pole to the equator with a longitude running through the most important place on the Earth, namely France, Paris. So I said, okay, what if I run that longitude through the most important place to God, which is maybe that place where this new temple is supposed to be built, which is where the old city of Luz was. And I did it, and the way that the French did is they took that distance divided by 10 million, and you wound up the length of a meter. So I did that, and it didn't come out quite right. So I then did the average elevation from the North Pole to the equator, running the same longitude, running through what I felt was where Luz was. And it was about 1,600 feet, I think. I divided that by 10 million, the end result. And the result was I had a meter that was slightly different. But when I took that value and multiplied it by 613 meters, my new value of meters, it came up to an average, a number of 24,136 inches. 2 times the number. Not kidding. It surprised me too. From 1021 BCE to an earthly king. Now, that's the end of the judges period when the congregation asked Samuel to choose an earthly king for them. So, from this date to the end of days in 1996, it started 50 years before the cataclysm, comes out to 3,017 years, or 1/4 of the 12,068 number. I'll stand over here. From 1004 BCE, David and Jerusalem. David chose Jerusalem as his capital in 1004 BCE, and to 1996, the end of days, when I was in Israel. Total of 3,000 years. Again, you wind up with the 6,034. 731, the death of David. From David, the beginning of the king's period of 1021 BCE to the death of David happened about 971, a difference of 50 years, 50 times 24. When I go from one computer to this one, it doesn't have the multiplication. It's a multiplication here, sorry. Times 24.136 equals the 12,068 number. Ignore the decimal point. It's the sequence of numbers at the message. 971 BC, David's death to God's day of judgment. Again, dies 971. Here's our drop dead date. The difference is 3,017 years, 1/4 of the number. Now, I think maybe the reason the word David is used so many times in the prophet section is maybe they're trying to tell us to make this connection between when he died to adding the 3017, because it shows up so many times, to give you a date. But I don't know. All I know is it turned out that way. 922, the end of a unified country. Again, the end of the judges period, or beginning of the kings, was 1021. And after Solomon dies, the thing basically falls apart. This guy, Jeroboam, is given 10.5 of the tribes, and we have 2 kingdoms, kingdom of Judah and kingdom of Israel. It's a little over 99 years, and that, I think, it's conjecture on my part, but I think it's close to 36,204 days. And my guess is probably that. So in other words, It's pre-programmed. Now, from the time the king's period started to when the unified kingdom ends, it was already predestined by God. It's going to be basically 3 times 12,068. I don't know. 721 BCE, the end of the kingdom of Israel. From 1021 BCE to the fall of the kingdom of Israel, that was this guy's kingdom that he started, Jeroboam, is 300 years again. 300 times 24.136 divided by 12 gives you the 6,034 number. 597 BCE, from the first exile to the cataclysm. The time of Nebuchadnezzar, the first exile was 597, and that's what Jeremiah and Baruch start counting from. From there to the October 16, 2046 is 965,440, which is 80 times 12,068. So 80 times of the 12,068 day cycles is that spread between the first exile to the cataclysm. Open to interpretation. Why? I don't know. 538 BCE, from the return of the beginning of the end of Judah by the Romans. 538 BCE, the first version of the book of Mark. In Babylonia, that's when they came back. To the first version of the book of Mark is Ura Marcus, which is 62 CE. And that is 600 years times that, you wind up with this, divided by 12, and the 12,068 number. Now we got a little American history here. July 4, 1776, Declaration of Independence. The two main authors were Jefferson and John Adams. Both became presidents. They die within hours of themselves, exactly 50 years after. July 4th, 1826, exact. It's like the hand of God says, yes, I did it. Again, 50 times 24.136 gives you the 12,068 number with a 0 after. Moshe Dayan, born 1915, May 20th, 1915, died October 16th, 1981. He's the general who designed the attack for 1967 that took back Jerusalem. And the total number of days he lived was 24,256. Well, that's not quite the number, but it's made up of two. The 24,136, which is 2 times 12,068, plus 120. The 120, if I remind you, is mentioned 3 times in the Torah. 2 times for age and 1 not. 3 times 120 is 360. That's a clue, actually, to the location of Mount Sinai. So even from his birth to his death, the number's encoded in there. It's all code. Now, this is a good one. This is profound, and the message is really to the British. If you remember in video part 1, 4 cycles back from October 16th, 2046, was when Woodrow Wilson gave his neutrality speech in front of the Senate. And said, you know, World War I started in Europe August 8th, and he decided the United States was going to be neutral. And instead of picking one side or the other, which told me that if he did pick one side or the other, then maybe the war wasn't going to last that long or end pretty soon. But no, they didn't. Now, during that war, the British Balfour Doctrine was to promise the Jews a homeland west of the Jordan River. About 1923 or 22, the League of Nations was formed, and they had a mandate to let the Jews in Palestine. They did. The Saudis came to them and said, no, we don't want any Jews there. It's our land. Even though the majority of the population in Jerusalem in the area were Jews, if you look at what the The census was, even for the Ottoman Empire, the vast majority of people in Jerusalem, like 80 or 90%, were all Jews. The Arabs weren't there. Okay, this is where it gets interesting and spooky. Now, October 25th, 1939, the British government winds up signing a mutual defense pact with, of all places, Poland, thinking that would discourage Hitler from invading the place. Well, exactly 7 days later, September 1st, 1939, 7 represents Mount Sinai, remember the code? Hitler invades Poland. This is German troops removing the border barrier between Germany and Poland. They figured, hey, we don't need this anymore, we own it. And so World War II started then. If they didn't sign this treaty, World War II wouldn't have started that date. Here's the interesting part. From this date, October 25th, 1939, to when the UN voted to create the State of Israel, November 29th, 1947, is exactly 3,017 days. 1/4 of the 12,068 number. Interesting? I'll tell you the conclusion I came up with. There's 2 things here. One, we got World War II because the British did not fulfill their promise of creating a Jewish state where they said. So God said this, okay, I'm going to raise an irrelevant man, a house painter, to become dictator of the most industrial country in Europe. That's going to destroy England. And it did. Because the Land Lease Act that the British had, that Churchill had to sign with the US, was FDR insisted that England, after the war, had to give up all their colonies. All of them. India, Australia, New Zealand, everything. That was the deal. And the story goes, Churchill went back to the Queen and said, if we don't, we're not going to have an empire anyway. We'll all be speaking German. So, there's another part of the story. The British, after the war, were still not satisfied that Hitler killed 6 million Jews. Oh no, of course not. What they did was they sent British troops, British officers, to Jordan to lead them to kill the remaining Jews that escaped Hitler's hell so they could be killed by the Muslim Arab hell. British are lovely people, aren't they? But God is not done with them yet. They've let in a whole bunch of Muslims who hate Christians and Jews and everybody else but themselves. And they're turning London into Londonistan, and they'll teach the British about hatred. Okay, back to it, the Holocaust. This is sensitive for Jews. My poor multiplication symbols keep converting in this computer. It's known that 6 million Jews died, times the length of the sacred cube, it gives you this. Divide by 12 of the 12 tribes, and you've got, look what we've got. The 12,068 number with 3 zeros after it. He kills us in numbers that amplify that he exists. So, okay, conclusion. Like I said earlier, we got World War II, so the UN and the Europeans and the Americans were so embarrassed what happened in World War II and the Holocaust, they allowed the creation of the State of Israel. But really it was an act of God. That's what happened. And the British got punished good, lost all their colonies, broke. Other part, aside from all of that, which just a little indication of what was found, and you'll find more. What bothered me the most, and I showed this in the earlier part 1, is this. There's 20 generations. I wondered maybe that's why Moses said, when you're 20 years old, you're a man. Maybe that's the 20 he's referring to. When it totaled up, I got the 2046, the year of when the next polar reversal is going to happen. But Moses is doing this 1306 BCE is the Exodus. 1305, they leave, they go south. For 40 years, he's writing the surface story of the Torah. A certain Roman family in the 1st and 2nd century did something and wrote something. How did he know 1,400 plus years in the future? He couldn't have known. The question is this is a Christian calendar. That's Constantine. I think he took office, power 1313 CE. So 1330 or 40, he's created the calendar. You know, I said 1340 here. I don't know exactly. Chris, a Christian calendar? You mean no matter what the Jews would have done, if they're good and followed God's orders and precepts, or they didn't, which a lot of them didn't, it still would have turned out that way? That's the question. Is this all pre-programmed? This is what's... Series 4 is going to be explaining everything about the Ice Age and polar reversal. If you doubt me that I figured out the mechanism, don't. I'll have it fully proved. I'll tell you a funny story from God's Judgement book. This one here. Chapter 8 has the whole explanation of what causes the Ice Age and polar reversals. 26 pages of endnotes from the journal Science, Nature, Geology, and others. I printed out that chapter. I mailed it with a cover letter to NASA, and I'll show this when I do video 4. And I just informed them. Wasn't asking for money, nothing like that. Just informed them of what I discovered. Well, within a month, they sent me back the pages. Now, I printed duplex on both sides. And they must have stuck this thing in a radar oven, because you couldn't open the pages up. They're all the toner glued together. They sent it back to me, and the terse letter said, "This isn't how you apply for a grant." Which I laughed my head off. I didn't ask for any money. Now, they didn't fuse this thing so I shouldn't read it. It's my stuff. They fused it together so nobody at NASA would read it. That's how I knew they knew I was right. So, what's going to happen, everything you saw in this video, is God screaming at us using that drop dead date, that anchor date of October 16, 2046. That's something, this event's going to happen. Now, so you understand how bad this event is, I had heard a radio show that anthropologists had figured out that only 30 fertile females survived the last ice age. Well, that's 11,000 years ago. This thing happened about 12,000 years. How many people survived the actual nova and everything else like that? I don't know. Point being is, even if they're wrong by a factor of 10 or 100, that's still extinction level. Now you understand why I'm doing these videos. It's to warn you and to try to wake people up that this event's going to happen, and God is screaming at us with this proof. I'm surprised I'm the first one that ever discovered this stuff, but it appears I am. And by sheer accident, as I explained in the first video. I hope you enjoyed this video. Diehole Foundation is a 501c3 science foundation, even though I cover a lot of religious stuff, but I explain why. It kind of morphed into it or blended into it. It's one and the same. And hopefully you're going to get a lot out of it. Tell people the only way you're going to survive something like this, it really is the action of government, because the things that have to be built are big, and you have to prepare long ahead of time. And I'm afraid we only have 28 years and a few months. That's really not enough time. But I've been trying since 40 years ago from the first book. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed it and hope it didn't scare you too much. But again, how much free will do we really have after what you've just seen and what you'll prove to yourself in your own life? You could do the same thing I did. How much free will is all this thing? Did he program from the end of time to the beginning of time? You know, the end of a cycle to the beginning of a cycle. so it comes out the way he wants. I don't know the answer to that. Maybe you do.